Have you ever looked at your bank account and then at the grocery bill and just felt defeated? Like no matter how much you work, how many hours you put in, and how carefully you budget, you're still falling further and further behind. Well, you're not alone. That feeling, that constant squeeze on your wallet, it's a shared experience for millions of people.
If you're financially stressed, you're not alone. A new CNBC Your Money survey finds 74% of Americans are stressed about their personal finances. That's up from 70% in our April report conducted by SurveyMonkey. And 37% of respondents say they're very stressed.
For decades, we were told that if you worked hard, you'd get ahead, that productivity would lead to prosperity for everyone. But somewhere along the way, that promise was broken. The cost of everything from your rent to your healthcare to a degree that you work so hard to get has exploded, while your paycheck has barely budged. And it's not just inflation, it's a complex web of historical shifts, economic policies, corporate power, all of that has fundamentally shaped our financial reality today. Today, we're facing a challenge unlike anything most of us have ever experienced before. The gap between rising costs and stagnant wages is at the heart of this issue. It's the economic trap squeezing everyone, especially younger people. It's an economic trap. You cannot earn enough to be able to afford things that are rising and rising in price. That's basically what's happening right now. And this unbalance of how much people earn and how much something is costing is very clearly demonstrated in terms of homes and home prices. For young people today, owning a home often seems like an impossible dream. According to the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies, the average home price in many areas is now about 5 to 6 times a typical household's income. To understand the scale of this change, consider the past. When baby boomers were in their 30s, a home typically cost about 3 times their annual income. This means millennials must save or borrow much more to afford a home their parents could have purchased with less strain. What about renting? Well, renting offers very little relief as well. Millennials face much higher rent costs, with the average 35-year-old millennial paying about $1.4 thousand a month on rent, compared to $1,100 for a boomer in 1990, adjusted for inflation. This increase consumes extra income, making it harder to save for a down payment or to pay off debts or to build financial security. The portion of income spent on rent underscores this struggle. From 2001 to 2022, the average rent increased by 21%, while renters' income grew by only 2%. Even with raises, extra earnings often go entirely to rent, creating a major obstacle to financial progress. This traps many people in a rent cycle, making wealth building nearly impossible. They spend almost all the money they earn on rent and utilities and food. Not much money is left to save up for a down payment to buy a home or to even travel or do anything. While housing costs grab a lot of attention, of course, naturally, the bigger economic picture of wages not keeping up with inflation is just as or even more damaging. The plain truth is that wages have consistently fallen behind. The real wages, meaning how much you can actually buy with your money after accounting for price increases, all of that, have barely moved in decades. For example, the Economic Policy Institute calls it near stagnation. This isn't some dry economic term. It basically describes the feeling of being on a treadmill, that you're always speeding up, but no matter how fast you run, you just stay in the same place. Beyond housing, other basic goods and services have become extremely expensive as well. Since 2020, overall prices have jumped by a total of 24%, with food prices climbing about 3% every single year. And while 3% may seem okay at first, it's the combined effect that makes it worse every single year. So 3 every single year. And you quickly realize that after a few years, it becomes almost impossible to afford certain things. For many Americans, this means making hard decisions, skipping healthy meals, skipping expensive organic food, having to get cheap, low-quality food because it's the only thing that's affordable for many people.
I just wanted to tell y'all I spent $100 at the grocery store on these items. $100 for 5 bags, 2 items, a drink, and some chicken, and some vegetables. The fuck going on in America?
Tell me why a diet of rice and beans plus some grocery bags just cost me $80. $80. And I know what y'all are thinking. You must have impulse purchased something. You're right. I did. Brussels sprouts and hummus. How dare I?
All of these things that are key to a stable, successful life, your health, your education, are becoming more expensive. College tuition, for example, has shot up by an astonishing 52% since the baby boomers' time and 143% since 1963. But the quality of the degree, you finish school and you can get a really good job that pays well. That's not the case anymore. Yes, of course, in the 1960s and 1970s, that was the case. If you had a college degree, you were almost guaranteed to be successful in life. Now, today, most people have a college degree and they're still earning maybe $3 more than the minimum wage, or some are still earning minimum wage. They finish university and they still earn minimum wage. So the cost of living is getting worse each year. We understand that. It's pretty visible. It's noticeable in your daily life. But there's another even bigger story unfolding in the background. It's that the benefits of economic growth are flowing overwhelmingly to a very small group at the top, leaving everyone else like you and me struggling to keep up. This isn't a new phenomenon. It's been happening since the 1980s. To really understand this, we need to talk about wealth. Not just income, but wealth. What people own, their homes, savings, stocks. If you were to draw a wealth pyramid with the richest people at the top 1%, for example, of households now hold a disproportionately massive share of the total wealth of the country, a share that's growing more and more over the past few decades. Think about it this way. Since the 1980s, the net worth of the top 1% has exploded. Their assets have grown at an incredible pace, often outpacing the growth of the overall economy. For the bottom 50%, however, net worth has barely budged, or in some cases has even declined when adjusted for inflation and debt. And so how did this happen? Well, a big part of the answer lies in asset inflation. This is a term that describes when the prices of assets like stocks, bonds, and real estate go up significantly faster than the general rate of inflation for everyday goods and services. This is asset inflation. It's different from regular inflation. Regular inflation is like the price of milk going up, or the price of certain services going up. Big difference is that asset inflation benefits those who own the assets. Now, to connect this back with the wealth gap, who owns most of the stocks, most the bonds, most real estate? It's typically wealthier people, wealthier households. And as these asset prices soar and grow over years and years, over decades, those who already had invested a bunch of money in assets get significantly richer. Their wealth grows, not because they're earning more from their jobs, but just because their assets are growing in value. They're appreciating in value. Meanwhile, for the majority of people, those who only have one home, or maybe two, or those who don't invest in the stock market, or those who don't have a lot of assets, they have to rely mainly on their paycheck, on their salary, and that hasn't grown that much compared to assets. This creates a vicious cycle. Those with assets benefit from asset inflation, increasing their wealth, which then allows them to buy even more assets, further fueling their wealth growth. Those of the majority of Americans without significant assets are left behind, struggling with stagnant wages, with rising costs, making it incredibly difficult to break into asset owning, to move up the financial ladder. And although it's very concerning what's happening, how the United States is becoming more and more unequal, it helps to zoom out and look at the bigger picture of human history. In fact, for most of our existence, inequality wasn't just a thing, it was actually normal. The way societies were built, we're talking about systems where a very small group of people held almost all the power and all the wealth, while the vast majority lived with very little. Think way back to ancient times. You had kings, you had emperors, and at the top, surrounded were the nobles and the priests. Everyone else were just peasants, farmers, or even slaves with almost no rights at all. Their lives were very short, were brutal, and dictated by those above them. Fast forward to the Middle Ages and you get feudalism. Lords owned the land, and serfs, who were basically like slaves, worked on the land and gave most of what the land produced to the lord. They couldn't leave, they couldn't own anything, basically like slavery. So for thousands of years, the idea of a few people having everything and most people having nothing was just the way how the world worked. And then came the Industrial Revolution, starting in the late 1700s and really taking off in the 1800s. This was a massive game changer. Suddenly we had factories, machines, mass production. This led to incredible economic growth and new kinds of wealth. Cities swelled with people moving from the countryside to work in these new industries. But while it did bring progress and new opportunities, it also created forms of inequality like factory owners and industrialists, lobbyists, incredibly rich people built massive empires. But the workers, the average worker, faced incredibly poor labor conditions, long hours, dangerous environments, child labor, and very, very low wages. The gap between the factory owner and the factory worker was huge. The factory owner had multiple homes, lots of land, lots of money, and the average worker lived very poor, having to live with other families in an apartment or a small home. Now let's fast forward to a truly unique period in history, which was very different from before, especially for the Western world. We're talking about after World War II, especially in the US. The decades following the war, roughly around the late 1940s, from the late 1940s to the 1970s, this was called the Golden Era. This was a time when the economy grew, and most importantly, the growth was shared much more widely. For example, the GI Bill. This played a huge role. This legislation helped millions of returning soldiers get a college education, buy homes, and start businesses. It was a massive investment in human capital that lifted entire families into the middle class. This era saw a massive middle class boom. More people than ever could afford a comfortable lifestyle with a stable job, a home, and the ability to save for their children's education and their own retirement. Strong unions were a key feature of this period because labor unions had significant power. They were bargaining for better wages, for benefits, for better working conditions. Jobs were also generally stable with good benefits and clear paths for advancement. Even when I was a child and growing up, there was still this belief that you had to work at a job for many years, go up the ladder, become manager, maybe even get a really high position and get an incredibly good salary. But that's not true anymore. That was true in the 1950s, in the 60s, 70s, maybe even the 80s, but today, that's not the case. So back then in the Golden Era, the gap between the richest and the poorest was much smaller than it is today. And if you worked hard, you had a real chance to move up the economic ladder, often doing better than your parents. Each generation was doing better than their parents. So we had this period of relatively low inequality, of shared prosperity for 30, 40 years. But what happened that led us to the cost of living crisis we're seeing today? Well, the shift wasn't just sudden. It was actually a gradual unraveling influenced by a complex mix of policy changes, technological advancements, globalization, so many economic factors. One of the biggest shifts, which you might not immediately think of, actually happened in 1971. To understand why this year was so important, we need to talk about something called the gold standard. For a long, long time, the value of money was directly tied to gold. Think of it simply, for every dollar printed, the government had a certain amount of gold sitting around in a vault. This meant that there was a natural limit on how much money could be printed. If the government didn't have the gold sitting around, it couldn't just keep printing money out of thin air. The system acted like a leash on inflation, so this kept prices from rising drastically. This kept inflation relatively stable. And if you look at this chart, you see, or this graph, you see that inflation, of course, grew a little bit, but it wasn't until the 1970s that it really sped up. So what happened? Well, President Richard Nixon made the momentous decision to end the gold standard. This move meant that the US dollar, and by extension most major currencies around the world, were no longer backed by gold or any other commodity. Money became what's called fiat money. Fiat is Latin for let it be done. And in this context, it means that money is declared by the government to be legal tender, but its value isn't tied to anything tangible. It just comes from trust in the government and the economy, and from the fact that people accept it for goods and services. In reality, the US dollar and most currencies, the euro, for example, are not tied to anything tangibly valuable. It's just trust in the economy, trust in the country. If trust in a country's currency disappears, then the value of that currency declines as well. And that's what you're seeing now with the US dollar. The US dollar has hit the lowest point in decades because trust in the US dollar is disappearing. And what's the benefit of doing this? Why would Nixon want to do this in the first place? Well, it's a huge deal because it removed the main restraint on how much money the government could create. Suddenly, the US government and more precisely the Federal Reserve, had the power to print as much money as it deemed necessary. There were no limits, so they just kept printing and printing, and it was incredibly important to print during this time because we had a very expensive war in Vietnam going on, and we needed more and more money to afford this war. So what followed was a period where the US began to spend more and more to cover significant expenses like the Vietnam War and new social programs. With the gold standard now gone, the government could now print more money to cover these deficits instead of having to raise taxes or borrow more traditionally. This ability to create new money became a powerful tool, especially during economic downturns or times of increased government spending. But anybody with a simple grasp of economics knows that if you keep printing and printing, what's the consequence? Well, of course, it's inflation. If you're old enough, you might remember periods of high inflation in the 1970s and the early 1980s. When there's more money chasing the same amount of goods, prices tend to go up. This directly impacts the cost of living for everyday people. Their wages struggle to keep up with rising prices. However, there's a crucial flip side to this story. While everyday goods and services got more expensive because of inflation, assets like real estate and stocks especially benefited. When new money is printed and introduced into the economy, it doesn't flow evenly. A significant portion of it can find its way into financial markets and real estate. This is where asset inflation comes back into play. So while the average person might have seen their purchasing power eroded by inflation on everyday items, those who owned assets saw the value of their investments soar. This fundamental change in how money was created and managed played a significant role in accelerating the wealth gap that we see today, making those who own assets even richer, while those relying on salaries or wages found themselves falling further and further behind. It was a subtle but profound shift that continues to shape our economic reality today. But there's also something that happened, and that's globalization. Starting in the 1980s and accelerating ever since, companies realized that they could just move their manufacturing and even some of their service jobs to countries where labor was much cheaper. This meant that American workers suddenly had to compete with workers from other countries who would accept much, much lower wages. This obviously put downward pressure on wages here in the country, especially in industries that were easily outsourced. Why pay an American worker $25 when you can pay someone in Bangladesh or India $5 an hour to do the same job? And so this global competition, while benefiting the consumer, so yes, clothing is pretty cheap and many things that are made abroad are cheap, but it comes at a significant cost to the American worker, to the American working class. It makes it harder for them to demand higher wages. But it's not just globalization, unfortunately. Another huge issue is corporate consolidation. Fewer companies, that means less competition, which means higher prices. Over the last few decades, we've seen a trend where big companies buy up smaller ones, leading to fewer and fewer major players in many industries. Think about airlines, internet providers, even grocery stores.
Airline mergers in recent years are resulting in fewer flights in the U.S., as well as a disparity in service and ticket prices between large cities and small ones. A new Wall Street Journal analysis finds ticket prices at the nation's 10 busiest airports, including Atlanta, Dallas, and Denver, have been stable, increasing around 1% on average from 2007 to 2014. But at the 90 next biggest airports, including Detroit, Honolulu, and Birmingham, airlines have raised fares more than 6% on average and cut available seating by more than 14%.
For example, I know certain places around the country where there's only one internet provider or one supermarket. And naturally, when there's less competition, then these big companies have less pressure to keep prices low or to even innovate. They can essentially charge what they want because consumers have no choice. This lack of competition translates directly into higher prices for everything from your internet bill to groceries. All of this contributes significantly to the cost of living crisis. So ladies and gentlemen, together these factors create a complex web of economic pressures that explain why, despite being a highly productive economy, so many people feel like they're falling behind. It's not just one thing. It's not just the money printing, which is of course a huge problem. It's also corporate consolidation. It's also globalization. Many things, many factors that caused the situation we're in today. Anyways, guys, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like. If there's something I forgot to mention, leave it in the comments below. I would really appreciate that, and I would love to hear what you think about this video. So leave your comments below. And if this is your first time on this channel, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch more videos like this, make sure to click this one here or this one here, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.